Introduced to our speaker for the webinar series, Dr. Peter Aiken. Peter is an acknowledged data management authority and associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, president of Data International, and associate director of the MIT International Society of Chief Data Officers. For more than 35 years, Peter has learned from working with hundreds of data management practices in 30 countries, including some of the world's most important. Among his 12 books are many firsts, starting before Google and before data was big and before data science. Peter has founded several organizations that have helped more than 200 organizations leverage data-specific savings, which have been measured at more than 1.5 billion US dollars. His latest endeavor is Anything Awesome. And with that, let me turn everything over to Peter to get his presentation started. Hello and welcome.
And welcome to everybody else. Shannon, thank you very much. And Nick and Guy, thank you for some excellent intros on here. I'm kind of honored to have you guys set us up for this. Our topic today is data management best practices, or I like to read you the titles, Practicing Data Management Better, because that's really what it turns out to be, is in fact a practice. Doing data better means that you're understanding the vastness and quality that plays really an increasing role in everybody's life. And you're motivated to increase your individual data skills, because you know that poor data skills cost your organization more, steal increasing amounts of your organizational knowledge workers' time, deliver less, and present greater risks all the way around with that process. Data management is a critical skill that we somehow have not yet managed to get the universities and colleges, of which I'm a part of the system, to recognize it yet. And that it's important to develop defensive skills as well in that process. In some senses, organizations are now trying to assign increasing values to the data that you use in the organizations in order to do this. And as Shannon mentioned, my most recent topic on this is on data literacy, where I've just come back from a quick tour of China, where they are really, really interested in that topic as well. And I think we need to pay attention to it, every country, as a matter of national priority around this. So let's talk about the program today. What we're going to do in the next 45 minutes is dive into and understand there's some frustration because most people are unsatisfied with the current state. And quite frankly, as a general category, we are not making progress. There are lots of individual exceptions, of course. The real question that comes back is, why are we not making progress? And the answer is, it's really a lack of a holistic approach. So I'm going to talk about the origins of what we're doing, building on some proven research that started out when I was at the DoD. There was something called the Software Engineering Institute, the MITRE Corporation, and CMMI in order to look at some of these things. Industry has a push for best practices, and that's actually kind of good. In fact, it's against the law not to go use best practices if you happen to be part of the US federal government. So what are the ingredients of this? Well, there's a data maturity model and a book of knowledge, and the key is how to understand and apply them together in this, because this whole data management practice is governed by something called the weak link in the chain architecture. We'll touch a little bit on strategy and the importance of a three-legged stool, which, no surprise to all of you, is people, process, and technology combined, and sort of finish up around the idea of how does one get better at this? And the answer is, of course, how does one get to Carnegie Hall? The answer is practice, practice, practice. We'll look a little bit at where to go next. And then, as Shannon said, invite Nick and Guy back in here at the top of the hour to do some Q&A and hopefully some very interesting topics that you all come up with. And of course, I always learn when they're on the line here as well. Let's just dive in. Measures of unproductivity in your organization is a really good place to start playing and looking at what we're talking about when we talk about improving data practices in your organization. The first thing to understand is that knowledge workers are under increasing amounts of stress. 33% of all knowledge worker time is spent reworking or recreating knowledge that already exists, and only 10% of their time is spent creating new knowledge and new content around that. So that is sort of a challenge that we're looking at. But more importantly, 53% of your knowledge workers would rather do household chores or pay bills than use your content management systems and repositories that are there. 74% of them feel overwhelmed or unhappy when working with data. 33% of them spend at least 1 hour a week procrastinating over data-related tasks. A couple more measurements here. Everybody has when we survey everybody, and by the way, these numbers are coming from the Data Literacy Project down here, who've done a very fine job of surveying these attitudes worldwide. 14% of them have a very good understanding of how to use data. And of our young generation that's coming along to take our place sooner or later, only 1 in 5 of them consider themselves data literate. More importantly, when I'm sitting around with business decision makers, 24% of them feel that they are able to, they're confident in their ability to read, work with, argue, and analyze with data. That's our very basic definition of data literacy. 33% are able to create measurable value from data. 27% say that their analytics projects produce actionable insights. And most importantly, when I'm sitting around a table with a group of executives, I can look them in the eye and say 4 out of 5 of you would pay me under the table to make you more literate around this particular process. So let's stop pretending and actually dive in and say we need to do some more education around this. Many organizations feel that the idea of putting better quality data in the hands of employees actually works. And you can see here again, same statistics, same surveys. When asked to do this, 52% of knowledge workers say that they will incorporate data into their activities, but 48% of them will defer to their gut. Now that's a very scary statistic. Why bother doing data at all if they're going to do that? Well, that's a piece we need to work on. And it gets more as we go up the chain. 2/3 of executives will defer to their gut as opposed to incorporating data into their decisions. The lack of data skills is really limiting our workplace productivity. Again, 50% of them incorporate data. 36% say they'll find an alternative method to complete the task without using data. I guess that involves a Ouija board, perhaps, or 14% will avoid the task entirely. Well, again, these are not really good no's that come out of this. Another question is, well, why haven't my data problems been solved when we moved to the cloud or built a data warehouse or invested in technology or hired a CDO or purchased Salesforce? All of these are good steps, but you've got to do them in the right sequence. Otherwise, it will be problematic. Let's just start off with sort of a basic, which is we're doing lots of data consolidation these days. And data that's in a cloud or a warehouse should be cleaner. It should have these 3 attributes that data outside of the cloud or the warehouse doesn't have. It should be smaller in volume, and it should be more shareable by definition. Let me take just a minute and explain how this works. Again, the original example here was warehousing, but it turns out it's exactly the same economics that go into the cloud because most people take their data and they move it into the cloud. You'll notice the original cloud is much larger now. And the problem with forklifting your data in this fashion is that there's no basis for making the decisions around this. There's no inclusion of architecture and engineering concepts and no idea that these concepts are missing from the process in the first place. And this is even scarier when you consider that 80% of your organizational data is ROT. ROT is an acronym that stands for data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. So how should it be done? Well, again, the idea is to take and look at this point of inflection where we're taking data from outside the cloud or outside the warehouse and moving it into it and transform. In the warehousing environment, this was called ETL, and transform was one of the key components there. Again, data in the cloud or in the warehouse should be less in volume, it should be cleaner, and it should be more shareable than data outside the cloud. Both of these, again, apply to cloud or warehousing, and more importantly, give us an opportunity for something called data branding, which I think both of our sponsors here have sort of alluded to in their talks before we did this. The idea is to say that there's some data that is of known quality and some data that is of unknown quality, and we'd like to use all of it, particularly, and have people use the known quality data as opposed to the unknown quality. Success in this area is a truly 3-legged stool. Again, if the airlines decided to put me on a 2-legged stool, I wouldn't have a very good experience with that particular flight. Equal amounts, and in fact, larger amounts of people and process than technology, but all 3 have to be present, and most organizations simply rely on technology. Another wonderful set of surveys that I've pulled from over the years. This is from Randy Bean and Tom Davenport. And again, the link for it is right down there at the bottom. But are you incorporating, are you driving innovation with data? This is the first year in 8 years of survey that we've actually gotten a greater than half. The rest of these aren't so good. Are you competing on data and analytics? In 10 are you managing data as a corporate asset, as a business asset? Again, 4 in 10. Are you creating a data-driven culture? 1 in 4. And are you forging a data-driven organization is 1 in 4. Are you forging a data-driven culture? 1 in 5 are doing this. But the most important part of this survey is that they've asked the question over the years, are your problems largely technology-based, or are they people and process based? And you can see here in 2018, it was 80-20. Again, these numbers are varying slightly, but you can see the overall direction is still largely around this, all the way even to 2023. 80% of data challenges are people and process-based data challenge. And data governance is the only resource that you have in your organization devoted to addressing these kinds of challenges that are in there. Yet we have this other problem where we try to communicate with things. Now, we're going to talk a little bit in here today about data security and governance and personalized environments, things like that. But the rest of the world just doesn't really get it. You may have data management and try to explain to people the difference between data management and data governance. And you know what they hear? Again, thank you, Charlie Brown, from that wonderful little soundbite that's there. Don't talk to them about these things. Talk to them about your data program. Make sure that they understand that a data program is something that you need to have in your organizations, and that really all of these pieces fit into it. They'll be satisfied with that. They understand, trust me, they do understand this. But if you try to give them too much detail, they are not going to get it. So while we're not making lots of progress, let's talk about what the actual pieces are. And this is a slide that I love because, of course, it has Alice and the Cheshire Cat on here. And this is what happens with many organizations. They come into this and they say, we want to move our data management program to the next level. But of course, if you don't know what level you are on at the moment, you don't really have any idea what the next level is going to be. If you're currently managing your data, but you can't measure it, how can you manage it effectively? How do you know where to put in time, money, and energy into these things in order to support the mission better? Now, I had a title when I was working for the Defense Department that was fancy. It was US DoD Reverse Engineering Program Manager. And during that time, we sponsored some research at Carnegie Mellon University. Sorry, Carnegie Mellon, I abbreviated you guys, at their Software Engineering Institute. Again, a very fine organization that I've been associated with for many years. Asking the question, how can we measure the performance of DoD and our partners in here? In other words, can we look at a process and say, are we getting better or worse at it in order to do this? I also was told to go check out and see what the Navy is up to, and found out that's where I ran into John Zachman the first time and Clive Finkelstein, both of whom became my mentors in this process. The SEI, in response to the DoD request, responded with an integrated process and data approach, but DoD required the SEI to remove the data portion of the approach because they said your name is the Software Engineering Institute, and so you shouldn't be talking about data. That portion that got cut off was literally lying around at SEI, and somebody offered it to me. And this fellow here, Bert Parker, and I put together a series of internal research projects for the MITRE Corporation based on this particular model, and a couple of grad students that were involved in all of this, coming around and understanding the scope of data management organized into 5 key practice areas. While this was good for an initial approach, and again, the reference is on here on the slide, you're welcome to go back and read it, or just ask us, we'll add it onto the slide deck that gets sent out. This wonderful individual, Melanie Mecca, who's been a dear friend for many years, really took the initial work that we had done and professionalized it. And so she spent a lot of time looking at these things and was the primary author of this thing called the Data Management Maturity Model. Now, the first release was done almost 10 years ago. It had wonderful sets of contributions. It has not had additional sponsorship since then, but there may be some things coming up in the future. on that real soon, because I know there's a lot of people that are interested in it. This reference model framework really specified specifically the maturity practices that are necessary if you want to do this. And it did this by putting in a structure for each of these 5 areas that I've mentioned. It's the core category, it's got a process area, there's a purpose, introductory notes, goals, core questions. It's not exactly scintillating reading, but it is hugely useful stuff. And we all owe Melanie a vote of thanks for devoting and professionalizing all of this. Just like anything else in terms of process areas, the model emphasizes behavior. It wants proactive, positive behavioral changes so that you can carry out and repeat effective practices, and leveraging those practices and extending them across the organization. These activities result in work products that produce processes, standards, guidelines, templates, policies, so that you can reuse these and make your staff happier because they'll spend less time being frustrated on this. The practical effects then essentially show you how to take this and evolve it to an all hands on deck approach. And the reason for that is critically important. All of your knowledge workers are doing something with data, and most of them have 0 training in it in order to do that. Just to give you a little bit of grounding in all of this, this is a wonderful study done by the Corporate Executive Board that looked at various ways of improving processes, ITEL, RUP, COBIT, and PMI. And you can see for those 3 on the right-hand side, actually introducing those frameworks into your organization means that your projects do not tend to finish on budget. But with the CMMI, there is a marked improvement in that ability to deliver on budget and again on time here as well. So these are the only scientifically improvable methods of showing how this stuff works. In fact, I wrote in my data strategy book a little piece that I'm just going to spend a minute and read to you. While all improvement efforts begin with the obligatory assessment phase, Carnegie Mellon's CMMI and DMM are the only proven frameworks that have the added benefit of literally decades of practice and benchmarking data. Organizations not using the DMM risk an inability to meaningfully compare results against other organizations, and as a result, adopt unproven methods. I can't tell you how many organizations I've gone into and they say, oh, the contractor told me we were using DMM, and I look at it and say, no, that's not in fact what they were doing. Or worse still, I had several of them tell me that they were using the DAMA method. Well, the DAMA method doesn't exist in this. So once again, it's something that you need to be carefully paying attention to. Let's see how these things work together. And I'm showing you this not from where I'm speaking to you right now, because I don't have a good enough internet connection here, but this is my home in Montpelier, Virginia, and you're looking at a picture of my barn. Now you might say to yourself, why on earth are you wasting my time, Peter, showing me a picture of your barn? Well, I do want to tell you a quick story about the fact that I'm what's called a horse husband. And that means that part of my dowry in getting engaged to my bride of 20 years at this point was that I had to build a barn for her. We didn't have the money at the time, so I borrowed money from the bank. And the bank gave me exactly this much money, enough money to build a solid foundation for my barn. Because if I didn't have a solid foundation for my barn, the banks in Hanover County, Virginia, where I live, understand truly that what would happen here is that the barn built, a good barn built on a poor foundation, might result in me not paying the loan back in this case, because as a horse husband, my first duty is to our wonderful 4-legged friends that inhabit the barn now. In order to do this. And once again, you're saying, well, wait a minute. Okay, maybe I see this. There's a process that you give out a little bit of this money so that people can get started on this, but that you've got to have a good foundation. Yes, I emphasize those words by striking my fist against the table. And the bank did exactly the same thing until I got a foundation inspection done, saying that this foundation had been in fact put together the way it should be and was capable of supporting the load that we intended to put on it. They weren't going to give me any more money. Now, this just makes good business sense, and I certainly appreciated it from the barn, but in particular, there is no IT equivalent of this, and this is something that we have to change in our practices, we have to change the way we educate people about it. We have to change the way we talk about it and say that data foundations need to be there before we build IT solutions on top of them, or we are taking bad data plus something awesome and coming up with bad results. Now, I also like to include a little bit on Maslow. Many of you remember this from high school. Maslow's big insight was that if we have food, clothing, and shelter needs, then we are never going to be safe. That physiological needs are a prerequisite, a necessary but insufficient prerequisite to being safe around this. Similarly, if we are never safe, then it's hard for us to become involved in something that is bigger than ourselves, love and belonging to a larger group on this. And if we do not have love and belonging in the sense of a larger group, it's very hard to know ourselves as well. Self-esteem is the next level up on this. And finally, even if you have self-esteem, the idea that you can get to self-actualization is, again, necessary but insufficient. If you don't have esteem, you don't have the love and belonging, you don't have the safety, you don't have the physiological needs met, you will absolutely not be able to work at your highest and best capability. Well, this concept of self-actualization has been hijacked by the wonderful TED Talks that are out there. They call this flow. It doesn't matter what you call it. You understand that you cannot be in flow or be self-actualizing if these other needs are unmet. And data is exactly the same as this. We have a wonderful set of technologies that we put in this golden triangle of advanced data management practices. Notice I've dropped mesh into there, crypto, AI and ML and all these other things. These are just technologies. And the problem is they are the tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding data. And that the foundational data practices, the 5 things that I've mentioned a couple of times already so far, are organizational capabilities. Those capabilities must be present and practiced at a high level of maturity in order to make anything at the top work at all. Now, even though I show this picture lots and lots of times on a regular basis, I still get asked the question, great, Peter, but I want to do it faster. And I say, well, of course, you can do it faster, but if you do it faster, it will take longer. If you do it faster, it will cost more. If you do it faster, it will deliver less. And if you do it faster, it will present greater risk to the organization. So it doesn't matter what you are doing in order to do this. You are going to have to do it in a way that provides a good foundation and gives organizational capabilities before you make significant invests in technology. In fact, the ratio for this should be 4 to 1. If you're going to invest $1 million in some sort of technology, I will tell you that you need to invest in most instances $4 million to make sure that that technology is fully utilized by the organization to its full capability. This is the main source of frustration with most of our vendor partners that are out there, is that they can't get people to understand how to use their products. They think it's some sort of magic, and of course it isn't in order to do that. Let's take it the next step, and notice I'm flowing across those 5 pieces. This is back to the CMMI research that I was telling you about, and let's just define them. If we're going to do data management strategy, it means we're trying to manage the data coherently. We don't want to have 1,000 different knowledge workers trying to implement 1,000 different components of data strategy. We need to do some things before we do other things. That's the essence of strategy around there. And that those data assets can be governed professionally. We've now been working in this area for well over 20 years and have a class of data management governance professionals that we can put in place and employ in order to do this. And we need to make sure we understand the data lifecycle and that manage the data lifecycle properly in order to do this, and that we have data that is fit for purpose. That's our definition of data quality in order to do this, with, of course, the right architecture, technology stack, whatever it is that you're going to refer to this, and supporting practices from the organizational as well. Now, I mentioned earlier on that this is a weak link in the chain method, and it certainly is. I'm going to give you an example of, first of all, the CMMI rating on this. You get 1 point for having a pulse. That's not a very high bar, but nevertheless, it does give you that 1 point. It gives you 2 points if you have the ability to have a repeatable process. Your repeatable process may be as simple as give it to Guy, who happens to be an excellent data manager. Guess, Guy, I'm picking on you for this one. I'll pick on Nick in a minute here, right? And if you get 3 points, you have now had Guy write down what it was he was supposed to do in order to do it, so that if Guy wins the lottery and takes off, somebody else can come along in his place and repeat those practices. I've worked for some organizations that had all that expertise tied up in one individual, which again, the more that individual has and the more likely they are to play the lottery, the more likely you are to have all that wonderful information go out the window. The fourth level of this is that we take that defined practice and we measure aspects of it. How many, how much, what's happening at each of its different piece. And finally, if you use those measurements to improve your existing practices, you now are awarded the 5 points of optimization. We'll see some scores on those in just a minute here, but let me just rate each of these things as a 3. So data governance is a 3, data quality, data operations, data platform. By the way, if those are the 3 numbers that come up there, if you do get rated at those levels, you are way above typical in this case. However, in this instance, hypothetically, that I'm managing it up, I've given the data management strategy just a 1, meaning that there is nobody who's doing anything to help prioritize these areas. And therefore, the overall effectiveness of this system is a 1. That is a very disheartening piece of news, because it shows that you must invest with a balanced approach in order to do this. So we've got the assessment components now. On the left-hand side here, you can see the little icon that I had on the front screen, looking at these 5 data management practice areas, and on the right-hand side of the screen, the 5 levels that I've spoken of. When a maturity assessment is done, you might end up with a very nice diagram like this that tells you what's actually happening. I'm going to discourage you from investing lots of money in this, and I'll tell you why in just a minute, but nevertheless, it is still a pretty insightful set of diagrams here showing that some areas had higher scores than others. And notice again, very few of these scores exceed the 3 line, the circle that's dots in the middle of that. That is, again, not even close to an average score. Here's another thing that we can do with all of these, and CMMI and Melanie and others have put together several benchmarks where we can look and say, hey, how are you doing with these various areas and things like that. Now, the idea with assessments here is it's generally not worth a lot of money for somebody to tell you that you're at the beginning of your journey. It really isn't. But you can use an assessment-like process to quickly and inexpensively uncover previously unknown pockets of excellence in your organization. And the first plan should be examining the feasibility of taking those pockets of excellence and expanding them to other parts of the organization. Let me give you a couple of concrete examples on this. Here is one that we did at one point in time for the insurance industry. And you can see here that the average insurance company at that point in time was not really doing very well. These are relatively low numbers in this case. Here's another example for an airline that I did. And you might wonder, as did their executives, why am I listening to somebody here who's talking about 1s and 2s? And then I was able to say, well, this is how your organization responds in these practice area assessment, but here is your competition. And you can see they are behind the competition in this case. That's the kind of message that corporate boards need to understand and what the impact of that is going to be on their business. We can also add in all the respondents and show that the averages here were pretty much average of all the thousands of companies that we have done doing this kind of practice area. One last quick example here. Oh, that's what I'm sorry. First of all, clearly the challenges here are to take the 1s and make them into 2s first, because remember, if I take 2 of the 2 1s and make them into a 2, I still only have an overall score of 1, as in my data practices are being held back, constrained by this weak link in the chain here. So we have to fix all 3 of these 1s to make them into 2s in order to get a overall score of 2. And more importantly, the score is not the important thing. The question is, what's actually happening in our organizations with respect to their data management practices. Here's one that I can give you the example of. You notice it says World Bank, and this was the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank that actually hands checks for large amounts of money to different people around the globe for all sorts of good purposes. In this case, we're going to look at their treasury group. You can see their treasury group was not very high. They scored a flat 1 on this, as well as their information systems group at the time, also scoring a 1, but the International Finance Corporation was actually doing world-class practices at the time. So here is a case where the International Finance Corporation business people were able to show the Treasury Group and the Information Systems Group how to do this process better, which is a much cheaper process in general than bringing in external consultants. You can see they were quite above the average for the banks all the way around, and also for the overall benchmarks. Again, very, very interesting pieces in order to look at this. We haven't done one of these surveys for several years. This is one of the other challenges that we have, in that nobody wants to invest the money in order to come up with these things. But this was still a very valid survey from 7 to 19, so a good 12-year period here. Coincidentally, by the way, this coincided with the hype around something called big data. Some of you may remember it, some of you do not. Turned out we were never able to identify big data, period, end of story, but that we were in fact able to benefit from big data technologies. Now, big data technologies doesn't sound quite as sexy as saying big data all the time, but nevertheless, it was a much more realistic portrayal of what was happening here. And of course, the key for this is that from 7 to 19, these numbers did not change at a time when the amount of data was exploding and continues to explode. In fact, if we look at literacy overall in our organizations, the US government has been surveying these things for several years. There's a couple of different labels for it. If you go back far enough, you'll find it as the National Assessment of Literacy in Adults, or Adult Literacy, and then they changed the name to PIAC, and I don't Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies. But the point is, these three numbers here that they've rated citizens of the United States in this case from a literacy, a numeracy, and a digital problem-solving approach also did not change from 12 the last time it was done to 17. Now that the pandemic's over, we may be able to get them to do it another time just to see, but not improving is by itself a problem. It's kind of like being in business and not understanding that you need to move ahead always, that just simply treading water in business is not going to be satisfactory under any circumstances. Let's move now to the idea of strategy around this. Now, strategy guides work group activities. It is one of the things that a work group shares, a similar shared understanding of what the organizational priorities are. And while you'll see lots and lots and lots of books and things out there on strategy, I don't like most of them, because really the word strategy originated in the military. And the business consultants picked up on it and said, great, I get paid by the PowerPoint, so I'm going to make lots and lots of PowerPoints around this. I'm being somewhat glib with this, but I also see this as many organizations that have 100-page data strategies that simply sit on a shelf and are not useful in this. If we look at the military context around this, it's a pattern in a stream of decisions. So what are we trying to actually achieve here, so that at the knowledge worker level, which is where your data is managed for the most part in your organizations, they understand the right thing to do, whatever that happens to be for the organization. Again, our theory here is a theory of constraints. Again, Elihu Goldratt put this piece out, but it's the idea of finding something in your organization that is constraining you from getting from an organizational level 1 to 2, or 2 to 3, or 3 to 4, if you're really fortunate in that. And that you need to make a quick exploit that constraint so that you can try to bring it up. Most importantly, though, you typically realize that you have to subordinate all non-constraints so that the constraint is fully exercised and that you put as much through it as you can. By the way, this is all based on a book called The Goal. If you haven't read that book by Elihu Goldratt on this, it's a wonderful analogy for everything that we do in data management. And of course, once we've alleviated that constraint, we don't stop, we move on to the next one. And this just hits a point here that Nick was saying, you've got to have a continuous approach in order to do this. You're never at the top of the process, and that you do want to continue to do these all the time. Let's take an example where the good guys are on the left and the bad guys are on the right-hand side. I might use one type of a strategy if I was playing capture the flag or war in order to do this. However, I might use a different strategy if we happen to be the kings of the hill and the bad guys are down here in the valley, or vice versa. If the bad guys are on top of the hill, I'm going to use a different strategy than the good guys. And the reason we understand this is because one of our previous presidents, Dwight Eisenhower, said, in preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but that the planning itself is indispensable. The idea that you're going to go consult a 100-page or 100-slide deck to find out what to do next in your data strategy is ludicrous. You're not going to know what the enemy is going to do. By the way, the enemy is data debt here and ignorance of data practices, data illiteracy in this case. So let's move on to a final component here in order to look at this, which is something I call a data sandwich. And that is the idea that all of our organizations are trying to leverage high performance automation. And they're doing this with uneven amounts of data literacy, uneven amounts of data supply, and uneven use of data standardization. Let me give you just a quick example of a very, very common use of data strategies here in the United States. One of our previous presidents, George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, signed a law that said we're going to use standard labeling for nutritional information of foods. And our American population has gotten quite good at looking at a label on a can and saying, this has the amount of fat that I don't want to consume, and I'm going to change that particular approach. A wonderful example of putting in data standards in the organization, and 15 years later, we've had a wonderful set of successes where people understand this. So how does that apply to you individually? Well, you're going to have to start to smooth your data literacy, get people more literate about this. And again, the idea is not just your data people, but all of your knowledge workers need this, that you're going to have to start smoothing out your data supply, perhaps using some of the tools and techniques that Nick and Guy described earlier here, and we'll come back to it in just a little bit. And employ limited use of data standardization, because if I can't get these three things to work together, I will absolutely not be able to do this. Notice a wonderful Deming quote on this. I don't think I gave him credit, but it says, this cannot happen without investments in engineering and architecture. In fact, I went all the way to India at one point to see this sign hanging on the back of this tea farm in India. Quality engineering and architecture work products cannot happen accidentally. Now, the fact that they put that over a cash register at a tea farm in India tells me that they understood that. And of course, if we add the word data in there, it obviously still applies in the major sense of all of this. So let's take a look at the other component that we need to have in this. And this is something that we in DAMA International are very proud of. We used to be that if you were trying to figure out what to do, you had to look at a book like this, which was the Handbook on Data Management Information Systems. Instead, what DAMA International did through wonderful efforts on our volunteers is create this icon for the DAMA DM BoK. We are now at version 2, and version 2 here you can see describes a number of practice areas that we have in order to look at this. These practice areas, of course, are critically important. We did not do a good job in one sense, that what we really should have said here is that these are things that can make up. We said these are things that do make up. So people will come along here and say, oh, well, the DAMA DM BoK says I must do document and content management. No, that's not, in fact, what we wanted to say. We wanted to, the data and content management are part of your overall data management practice and could be more or less important depending on exactly what's happening within those areas. Similarly, we also didn't show any dependencies in these areas. The idea that it's probably a good idea, although we did put it at least at the center, to put the data governance in place here. And I'll show you how that works in just a second. I'll also note, just for the record, that twice in a row we've made the data quality chapter the last one. We need to correct that in the next version going forward, just so that people don't understand that data quality is last in order to do this. So when you're looking at these areas, what you see again is that three-legged stool that I mentioned before. Most of the time, you're not going to be working in just one pie wedge, but you can't do them all at once. So it turns out the rule of three becomes very, very useful. You may, in fact, start out by saying, I want to build some data that goes into a data warehouse so that I can collect it from our legacy transaction systems. By the way, definition of legacy is any system that's in production right now. There's no point in arguing about it. Let's just call it exactly what it is. The idea of doing a data warehouse without simultaneously trying to approach data governance and data quality at the same time is simply ludicrous. Notice also that the organization gets a 1x participation point or experience point in that area in order to do this. And going on a little bit further, the same organization might discover that while we're doing data warehousing and governance well, so we're getting 2 experience points in this, there was a deficit in the organization around metadata management. And so that we need now to shift our efforts from strictly focusing on quality to instead focusing it on metadata management in that area. A third version of this same thing might now say, okay, we started off with data quality and metadata, but it turns out what we really need to do is look specifically at reference and master data management. So the organization here has gotten 3 experience points for governance and data warehousing. We would expect those practices to be more mature than reference and master data management, metadata management, and data quality management, which we've only done 1 experience point each in order to look at that. We have a lighthouse metaphor that I love to use on this, which is the idea that you have things that could further the organizational strategy as you're trying to say, what can we do with data? But that you also have some data that you understand can be improved for use by the business to achieve business objectives. That intersection between those 2 points on the Venn diagram is a great place to do it. But we can also add one more qualifier, if you will, or one more slice there, and that's the opportunity to practice needed data skills. And when you have all 3 of those lining up in one place, that's really your golden triangle that you want to start on for your next data management process. And again, the question I asked earlier on, how does one get to Carnegie Hall? Well, of course, the answer is practice, practice, practice. But we need 2 things in order to do that. We need some good music. You know, I'm going to not make the claim that Stayin' Alive by the Bee Gees is a great piece of music. I actually hated that song more than any other song on the planet in 1977 when I graduated from high school. But when I saw Bruce Springsteen do it, I realized it was a great song just done in a disco style. The reason it sounded great from Bruce Springsteen is because his band practices, practices, practices. As long as I've been doing this, that band has been practicing as well, coming up with some great music around that. All right, a little bit now here as we move towards the last few minutes. First thing is to understand that all of this involves human beings. I've said several times, people and processes are critically important in order to do this. And we have a definition of a profession called change management and leadership that helps the organizations understand this. Similarly, if you're going to become ready for this particular process, and I look at the organization and I see it has vision and skills and an incentive and an action plan, but I see frustration, I know that they don't have the resources. Similarly, if the symptom is anxiety, I know they don't have the skills, and you can fill out the rest of this chart for yourself. Only when all of these things line up, just as the 5 parts of the key that I'm lining up here in order to do that, do you actually get change? So it's not just data, it's not just technologies, but it's culture in the organization itself. And culture is the biggest impediment to shifting organizational thinking about data. I have a full case study on this that is free for you to download. You can click on the link when you get the slides from Shannon around this. But what we're really talking about here are some very big changes. The volume of data is increasing much faster than we're able to process it. The data interchange and overhead are all costs that measurably sap organizational productivity, and that the reliance on technology alone approaches has not materially addressed this gap over the last 20 years. Finally, there is an industry type whose sole purpose is to extract data from citizens and then use it to make money. So being defensive about the process is absolutely critical. Process is more important than results. You're going to have to start practicing. I know if you've ever been in a house that a musician starts to learn how to play something, it sounds terrible at first, but it will get better if they keep at it. That failure in itself is a lesson in order to understand how this works, that we need to learn from these mistakes. It's not just that we make mistakes, but we learn from those mistakes, and that people and process aspects are not receiving enough attention as we try to improve our data, but that best practices in fact do exist. And again, if you are working for the United States federal government and not using best data practices, the penalty for that is actually higher than a HIPAA violation. That usually gets people's attention right away in there. So practicing data management better means we have to understand that we are unsatisfied with our current state. And almost everybody will agree with that, but that we haven't been making progress by simply throwing technology at the problem. That we need to understand there is a good basis for this, and that this basis, it does have a sound, scientific, proven results that we can do this better than we would do it with other approaches. And this is the push in industry for best practices around that. There was a comment not too long ago that said best practices mean you can only be mediocre. But remember, most organizations aren't even mediocre in here. So I've talked a little bit about the DMM and the DM BoK so that you understand how to apply them together to address the weak links in your chain with a little bit of strategy. There's more on strategy that you can do, and that it is a combination of people, process, and technology that requires lots and lots of practice in order to do this. Just to let you know, Shannon and I are starting our, I think, 14th year of these webinars in here. It's been a wonderful partnership, Shannon, over the years. And with that, I will turn it back over to you.
Peter, thank you so much for another great presentation. It has been, I can't believe it's almost 14 years now we're going to be working on here. And agree that has been a great partnership. If you have questions for Peter or for Nick or for Guy, feel free to put them in the Q&A panel of your screen and to answer the most commonly asked questions. Just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email to all registrants by end of day Thursday with links to the slides and links to the recording. So diving in here, we had a question come in, Nick, on your question, does precisely self-learn?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Precisely's data integrity suite is built on a shared data catalog across all of our services. So it does incorporate specific machine learning ML capabilities that learn patterns and habits to help teams deliver like more accurate, consistent contextual data to the business. So the real value of that is, yes, we can garner data intelligence that includes recommendations and alerts that are machine learning based.
Awesome. Thank you. And Guy, for you, where does Satori run?
Satori can run as a hosted service, or it can be deployed within your environment. So it's pretty flexible depending on your current data architecture.
I love it. And thanks for those questions. Great presentations for the both of you. Okay, and then moving on here. So it's on the slide before the lighthouse, Peter, if an organization wants to do everything from scratch on a new setup, what would be the order if cannot start on all segments at the same time?
Well, I think both Nick and Guy indicated that most of these, it's not appropriate to pre-specify that. Certainly, at least in the DM BoK, we talk about data governance being a central component to this. But each solution is going to be different from your organization. Let's just take a step back. And I'm back from a trip to China. in here. And yes, still all over the world, they have these wonderful signs in all the airports that say all the best companies run software X, whatever software X is. In order to do that, if you think about it, if they're all running the same software, which means they're all following the same business practices in those areas, what is left to differentiate these organizations? And the answer is the data in their organization. So if you might have two companies running the same software and one of them has good data and the other has questionable quality data, you will definitely not achieve the results that you're looking to achieve. So there's really no way of saying here what you should do as a starting place. But we, the three of us, are looking at you all, the audience, and saying, you are the experts in this area. You are the ones that know where the organizational pain is, that know that if you could change this aspect of the sales process, you would be able to increase your sales by 3%. Well, gosh, that's a great number for most organizations in order to do this. Or you'd be able to lower costs by a certain percentage, or you'd be able to address certain types of customer needs that they're not able to meet now. So I don't want to say there is no starting place on this, but that you as the audience know the best starting place. And of course, if you have any questions more specifically than that, give Guy or Nick or I a quick call and we'll be glad to walk you through that next step in the process. I hope that makes sense. And I hope I don't sound like I'm weaseling out on this, but it really is a bespoke solution for most organizations, a custom solution. Nick, Guy, you guys want to add anything on that?
No, I'll actually agree. You know, you kind of hit on a nerve for me there, Peter. There's really a couple things. It's where the data is, it's how you're using it, and it's how you're pushing it to make business decisions. And depending on where your pain points exist, whether it's in data storage, data access, or data decisions, that'll really help drive which of these is your weak point. That'll also help drive what tools you bring in. That'll help drive how you pitch this to upper management. But like Peter was saying, we can't tell you where your pain points are.
I'm sure you've got a similar approach to security, right? You don't just go down and lock everything down. You mentioned you had the ability to do practically individualized approaches to it. I'm sure it's within a context of role-based, but nevertheless.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, engineering needs different access to data than leadership, than IT, than support, than the data engineers themselves. You gotta find the problem for the solution, or vice versa. I'm seeing a lot of things on here that if you improve one, improves the rest as well. And if you improve your data quality, you're going to improve your data modeling. If you improve your data security, you're going to improve your data management. There's no single tier here that's going to fix everything.
But an absolutely great question. Thank you so much for asking.
Indeed. And Nick and Guy, feel free to jump in at any time on any of these. This is great. Love this. And so with AI being such a hot topic, have you ever had any trouble stressing the importance of improving your foundational data practices in order to set your organizations up for success with their future technology projects?
You guys want to go first on that one? I've got a very glib answer to it, but I think it's appropriate.
Well, let's first remove a little bit of the marketing around AI, right? Large language models and Gen AI has an attribute right now in the market that's overhyped, I think. You know, data science has been around for a while, and using self-learning models to improve that is probably what people really mean when they say AI is coming around. Is how can we make our business decisions self-driven? Ask a question, get an answer, instead of ask a question, define a solution, build a product, get an answer. And so there's a couple key things I think that are not really looked at. And the first one is, how is that AI or data science platform accessing your data? Is it accessing it in a secure way? Is it storing it in a secure location? Or do you have audits around how this AI is getting that data, or who granted that access? Is it give me a copy of Peter's access, or Nick asking for some stuff because he needs a smarter business decision? If you can decouple those questions, you can get to the root of the answer.
Yeah, I'd probably just echo what Peter had mentioned earlier about this is just throwing technology at the problem isn't necessarily going to fix it. But actually taking a step back and diagnosing, okay, we see like we've seen over the last year or so how many AI tools and companies and startups have come up out of nowhere, throwing AI at every single problem out there. And similar to like the dot-com bubble, only a small percentage of them are actually going to provide enough value to stay around. And so I think that's kind of the approach that we've kind of been taking it is focusing much more on the foundational data practices and stressing less about AI ML and being more very prescriptive about how we implement that.
And truly, I am sitting at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, in the School of Business. However, if I go out of my office and walk to the edge of my Bluetooth range, I will be in the computer science department. And what I get from the computer scientists that are down there, and they're my friends and colleagues and have been for many years, is that they'll come around to me and they'll say, "Hey, Peter, have you got any data that looks like this?" And of course, I know what they've done. They've come up with a wonderful new algorithm. And that algorithm, fortunately or not, has no utility at the moment. They have to find a use for it. And of course, that's just backwards. What we should be doing, as both of our guests have mentioned today, is that we should be finding out what are the business problems that we're attempting to solve and then designing solutions for it. But unfortunately, we reward these individuals with just simply newness. And newness is not good enough as far as that goes. And this has led us to several AI winters that we've had. If you go back and look over the here, it's another talk that I do. But if you look over the period of AI, we've had several places where it gets to this peak hype, as was mentioned, and then it falls down into the trough of disillusionment. Now, it's not to say that we haven't done anything good, but we've gotten as far as we've been able to with this. And where we are right at the moment with respect to all of this is that my colleagues around the corner and in many other fine computer science departments around the world have come up with what they call learning algorithms. And all they need is a great set of data to train their algorithm on this new technology, and everything will be great. Well, guess what? That data comes from the three of us who are telling you all what you need to put in place in order to do this, so that you don't, in fact, end up learning that the difference between a dog and a wolf is that wolves only exist in snow and dogs do not. Of course, if you could have seen my dog this morning, it was in snow. So we know that is just simply false. So I'll just close out this AI discussion with a couple of points. And first one is that your job is not going to, AI is not threatening your job. What is threatening your job is somebody who knows how to use AI better than you do. And that's a really, really hard sort of a process to learn, which means all of our students, all of our employees, all of our knowledge workers need to be playing with AI and understanding what does it mean to work with a technology that hallucinates at a rate of about 15%. I'm pretty sure my students wouldn't put up with me if I gave them 85% good stuff and 15% stuff that was absolutely complete rubbish that I had made up in the process. And again, it's not that all of it is bad, but that's certainly the error rate that we have in the ML community right at the moment. One last point on this, and I know that Informatica is not a sponsor here, but I do have to give them credit. Their new tagline for this next year is "Everything's ready for AI except your data," which I thought was kind of a nice little tagline on that. So maybe we'll get them to come on and sponsor a line for us one of these days, Shannon.
Indeed. Thank you. So, so many questions about AI and what's going on right now. I love it. So, but diving in here, what industry certificates and credentials are available based on the DM BoK? Peter, I know you have answers for this one.
Absolutely. As part of the efforts, again, the volunteer efforts at DAMA International, we have created a certification program that is called a Certificate of Data Management Professionalism. The basic place, if you're interested in learning more, is something called cdmp.info out there on the web. It gives you some scores, statistics. You can also go to the DAMA website, dama.org, and take a look at it as well. We've had, like I said, about 4,000 individuals pass through this program and become certified in these areas. There's much more detail out there on that, but it's certainly a good one. And we know it's good because we are now starting to see requisitions, even in China. Last month, one of my sponsors came up and showed me and said, "Hey, look, we are looking for people over here who have a CDMP." So it is a certification that is becoming respected, is becoming utilized in more and more places, and more job candidates are being asked to have this certification in order to do it. That is not to say that you will know this entire wheel by the time you're finished. We're giving you a baseline of it, and that you can go on and get additional levels. I won't make too much of a commercial here on that, Shannon, but thank you for the opportunity. We always like to have more certification done as opposed to less.
Indeed. And I said DM BoK, and just to reiterate for those who are not familiar, it's a data management body of knowledge. It's our common our common acronym that we refer to it as. And when will the next version of the DM BoK be published, Peter? Do you know?
The question that everybody wants to know the answer to. Well, the answer is it'll be done when it's done. But we are, in fact, organizing to do this. We've hired at DAMA International as one of our first contractors that we've been able to bring on, somebody who does have experience with building these out. So while the first two versions were done by volunteers, we're now going to have a professional approach to the next version of it. And there will be some announcements in the near future.
Very nice. And it was not that long ago that 2.0 came about. So
2017.
Yeah. Is there any generalized statistics on where companies most commonly struggle within the DAMA framework?
Let me again toss this one back over to Nick and Guy and say, from your individual perspectives, where do you see the most problem areas? And I'll go ahead and put the framework back up there so that everybody can see what we're referring to. Who wants to go first, Nick?
I'm actually going to pass it over to Guy. I'm
right.
thinking about it for a second.
Yeah, didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No worries.
Yeah, so from our perspective, at least at Satori, we find that data operations and architecture are typically pretty set. You get decisions made at, this is where we're going to store our data, this is how we're going to store it. Operations in the ETL space and downstream, where we're finding at least the hardest part to get change is in governance. A new regulation came down and we have to delete users from access. And deleting a user doesn't necessarily mean deleting them from the database. That could mean hide them from responses. It could mean a number of different things. And how you manage these assets, how you govern your data, tends to be a really hard problem to solve if you don't have the right tools in place, or at least the right mentality to get these tools in place. I'm not saying use Satori necessarily. Obviously, that'd be pretty cool from our perspective, but there are a ton of solutions out there, whether they focus more on compliance or more on enforcements of this compliance, where how you manage your data assets can really start empowering speed to data product. An example I like to use is in the healthcare industry. They've got an immense amount of data that is super protected by regulation, at least here in the United States. And that doesn't mean that a organization who's hosting healthcare data can't use it to garner business decisions. They have to just be very, very careful with how they access and expose that data to policies. And so that, from at least from where I sit and the customers that I touch a lot, implementation and definition of governance seems to be a huge problem.
Super.
And I forgot to mention, so Nick and Guy, I saw that you put in the chat, because there was a request for your contact information. So if y'all didn't see that, you can scroll up and see that their links there. And of course, I'll send that out in the follow-up email as well. So moving on to the next question here. So over the past 20 plus years, I've discovered and shared many documents with leadership from the sources mentioned here. In every instance, they have dismissed it as a nice to have, or we don't have time for that. Have I somehow missed finding the silver bullet all these years of, sharing this with management?
The real key with this is a short feedback loop and demonstration of benefits. In some organizations, that demonstration of benefits is going to look very different from other organizations. So I once went into one organization and justified an entire investment in technology and people in practice issues based on the fact that they were turning over their sales assistants every 90 days. I'm sorry, I said sales assistants, sales analysts every 90 days, and that company cost that company cost to replace a sales analyst was $50,000. So imagine this terrible scenario. You've got somebody that's supposed to be telling you where to put your products in the marketplace, and they only last 90 days on average. And that even when you do that, it still costs you $50,000 to replace them. Well, that set of costs right there was more than enough to justify the entire initiative around something that should have been obvious, which was that they had 4 unintegrated sales systems that were telling them where to put their products, and that the sales analysts were extremely frustrated because they spent 4 days a week integrating data and not analyzing it. And of course, that was not really the job that they felt they had been hired in order to do. But Shannon, before we lose the sort of silver bullet approach, I agree with the idea that governance tends to be a weak link in the area, probably because it's the most recent of these that we've done. And on one of your publications, Dataversity publishes a wonderful piece called, oh goodness, TDAN, the Data Administration Newsletter. And 2 of your other stars in the field, John Ladley and Tom Redman, published an article recently saying that data governance had failed. I don't know that I necessarily agree with them 100%. I've seen lots of instances where it has succeeded, but I think they're speaking generally, which I don't know that they are inaccurate on that. And I will try to include a link to that article in the pieces when we send out to you, because it was kind of a thought-provoking, and both of them like to be a little provocative. So no problems from that perspective on that.
Nick or Guy, you want to add anything? And have you found some success in working with your customers and talking to executives, and what helped get them on board?
I'll just double click on what Peter said. It's you have to find the pain point for that leader. A chief revenue officer is not going to care about an improvement in technology. They're going to care about cost spend and how can they improve their bottom line. A CTO might care about time spent by a team operating on tickets. A VP of data engineering might care about the amount of time it takes the data query to return. So you can't come with a template and say, oh, I have a MITRE framework that we need to follow because it's industry best practice. You have to find the thing that leader particularly cares about, and make sure that the solution you propose has at least some mapping to that.
Yeah, just
a
I guess
lot of marketing.
you can call it a triple click. There really is, I don't think, a silver bullet here. I think, that's kind of why Precisely is really preaches this kind of business first approach, which is just really abstracting. Like, no one buys data governance for the sake of data governance, but really because it solves like a business problem behind it, right? So backing up and trying to spend some time trying to figure out what is the business problem that is data governance, for example, could address. And that's one of the reasons why our strategic services team is really so valuable. Since they've been there and done that for over 50+ years, they use this proven methodology to bring experience that kind of sorts as part of that equation out. That's so difficult to really figure out in the first place.
Great question.
I love it. Yeah. So we could probably do a whole webinar on this next question, and we have a little bit. But doing data better. Can you explain the role of data architecture and data governance in good data management?
The main thing that most organizations forget when they're talking about architecture is that architecture represents things, what those things do, and how those things interact with the other things that are part of the architecture. Now, that's about as abstract as you can get. And maybe people unfortunately stop right there, but there's one additional component. And architecture has a purpose. So the purpose has got to map up to faster, better, cheaper, or less risky. And by the way, not all at once, because that's nirvana and none of us actually get there. in this particular lifetime. So there has to be an emphasis. You have to say, we are going to emphasize in this architecture speed, or again, security or whatever, but you cannot do all of it. And if you don't do any of it, you have sort of a bland thing that's not really helping your organization in the best way that it could. Again, great question. Again, Guy, Nick, what you want to add on that?
Go ahead, Nick.
Peter probably does the best, has the most comprehensive answer here, but I'd say that just doing data better will always be a combination of people, processes, and technology, and so they must exist together in order to kind of really drive home that what precisely calls that data integrity.
There's the ratio of, again, I get this a lot, and I'm not sure I hit it very well in the presentation, but let's just say somebody comes along with $1 million investment. My guidance to them is, if it's $1 million investment in technology, you're going to need $4 million in order to make sure that that technology is utilized fully and best. And so it's best to think about it. If somebody says, I want to spend $1 million on it, to say, where's the other 4 million going to come to make sure this technology is successful for our organization? And if the answer you get back is no, I've only got $1 million, then I say, well, you need to scale back your technology investment to about $200,000 and put $800,000 into the reinforcement aspects of it.
Very nice. So what would you say is a basic understanding or knowledge worker needs to know with their eyes glazing over?
The key, of course, is not to glaze their eyes over. Most knowledge workers do not need many courses in statistics and other things in order to understand all of this, but it really does come down to basic data literacy components. And it is so important in China. I just can't resist this. I know I'm showing a screen here, but let me just pop up a quick little piece that I was looking through earlier here to show you how much most organizations are actually paying attention to this. And where is that? There we go. So here we go. This is how much the Chinese people think it's important. They made an enormous book. I call this the big print edition of the book. But nevertheless, it is still quite clear that if we don't take society in general and improve the literacy around this, we're really not helping, because then it just is seen as a technology problem. And it's got to be viewed as an overall societal problem in order to come up with this. This is probably getting beyond Guy and Nick's remit. I'm sure you guys are trying to change the world as well, but this is really how it's going to do. If we can start to put these types of concepts in place to say that everybody needs to get more data literate, and that is as important as having the right technology in order to do it. Again, having an electric car is great, but if you don't understand recharging on an electric car, you're going to have some problems with it. Guy, Nick, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think just kind of focusing on helping them the amount of time to understand how for example, I keep going back to data governance, but how data governance can benefit them. They don't necessarily need to know the entire scope, how it works right. You don't need to dive into how Tesla's batteries work in order to charge it up. You just need to know enough to tell them how to plug it in and unplug it.
Yeah, and remember, what other part of your organization is going to even be addressing these kinds of problems, assuming the organization recognizes that those are the types of problems. Data governance is the only resource. There is no other component in your HR department's not out there teaching people how to be data literate at the moment. It's just not part of their remit.
Indeed. So many questions around communication, right? Just learning who is your audience and how to best address them. We've got about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to try and get in as many questions as possible. So can you reiterate why you would choose to address only 3 practice areas when setting up your data strategy? Why not try and define all knowledge areas in the strategy?
Well, of course, how much do you know at the beginning of your journey? It's like trying to say how much is how long is a project going to take and going to cost, right? It's just a very difficult proposition because these are new areas and most people who are involved in them have not done it once. Nick mentioned before that I think it was Nick that said his organization had 50 years of experience that they brought to this. That is a wealth of experience that most people haven't had a chance to grow and learn from. Again, one thing about being old is that you've seen a lot of stuff, and hopefully I've learned some things from that process. I'm sure my 2 colleagues will agree with that as well. And the idea of 3 is that it's generally a good rule to say that, we should not try 6 at once in here. And that if we do, I've seen groups do 4, but 3 seems to be a great number to start off with. And then that orange circle in the center seems to be the part that organizations are struggling with the most. And notice, of course, it is kind of central to the overall model, central to the overall piece. So yeah, if you try to do this, there are 11 pie wedges here, or 1 circle and 10 pie wedges if you want to get technical about it. But how are you going to become good enough to figure out what you're supposed to do in each of those areas right from the start? It's a very, very difficult process. So get good at a couple things. Not all organizations are going to be dependent on document and content management. Not all of them are going to be really, really dependent on purposely developed data storage and operations management. Yes, everybody's going to have them, but if you're going to really need to have supercharged access, the way Microsoft likes to advertise their cloud, available everywhere, ubiquitous, instantly, hey, that's going to be an important component. So once again, I'm turning the question back around to this wonderful group of hundreds of you that are out there and saying, hey, you are the best experts in your organization as far as knowing where you should start and what sorts of things you should take off onto. Again, I'll let the guy Nick jump in here as well, please.
Yeah, I just want to say that it's also important to not really think about these as singular vectors. Where Peter recommends starting with 3, and all of us would argue that more is better and than less, but solving one sometimes inherently solves others. And when you do solve these problems, you want to also think about them dynamically. Don't set things in stone that are going to pigeonhole you into other solutions or problems later. If you're creating a data model that can be used for an AI prediction algorithm, make sure that the algorithm isn't locked into this model, that it can adapt to other things. Or if you're writing a data security management standard, can this standard cohabitate with other architectures or other data stores? Solving one solves multiple almost always.
Excellent point.
Yeah, I would just agree with Peter. We have a lot of instances with Precisely where a lot of companies will try to catalog all of their data, only to really find out, from our understanding that only really 5% of it's critical to decision making. And so, starting small and proving value is really important. And that's kind of the whole, and when I talked about in my presentation, the whole piece about, starting exactly with where you experience the most amount of pain, right? I know Peter had that slide up that talked about, like, if you, out of those 5 categories, if 2 of them are 2 out of 5, but 3 of them are 1 out of 5, well, overall, you're still 1 out of 5. So, that's the weakest link. So working on those initially, and then starting to build up everything as you continue to grow.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for this great presentations and discussion. It has been such a great webinar, and thanks to all of our attendees who have been so engaged in everything we do. We just really appreciate all of you. And again, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and links to the recording and everybody's contact information. So thank you all so much, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Nick, real pleasure working with both of you.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.